explore today what you can do with Chenille It blooming bias. It comes in two different widths, 3/8 inch wide and 5/8 inch wide. The first quilt that we're going to look at today is the Hexagon, G-O-N-E. This is the full-size quilt for that pattern, and now we're going to take a look at the step-by-step. Hexagons are traditionally done with individual hexagons, like the one I have in the center of this piece. But we are going to make a hexagon quilt that looks like it's all been pieced, but we're using one large raw edge applique that is just the shape, the outside shape of the grandmother's garden traditional hexagon design. So the large pieces, raw edge pieces, have been placed on my pillow top. On this we're going to make a pillow. You would do the same thing if you were doing blocks on a quilt. And once you have those in place, you're going to stitch close to the edge of those raw edge appliques, and you can see here where I have stitched just close to the edge, any place where there is a raw edge. And in the center of these grandmother's garden large applique pieces, I have added just one single hexagon in the center. And now we're going to cover those raw edges with the 3/8 Chenille It. This is the 3/8 inch width. I'm using the natural color on this pillow top. And you can see where I have already stitched it, how easy that is to stitch down. And we are going to bring that over to the machine. All I need to do to cover these raw edges is take the 3/8 inch width and lay it down. I'm not gluing it, I'm not doing anything fancy. Put it down where I want to start. And start covering these raw edges. Now these are very short lines on the hexagon. So when I can see ahead that I'm going to have to turn right here. But there's no right or wrong side to the blooming bias. So all I have to do is flip my Chenille It, hold that down at the corner, and I'm going to stitch down to that corner, leave my needle down, I've already flipped it, and turn it and go the other direction. And I'm going to have almost another immediate turn, so I'm just going to, work ahead and have that turned. Stitch down the center of the tape. I'm using a 2.0 stitch length. I'm stitching down the center of that tape, turning the corner, and I'm going to do that all the way around the outside of this hexagon. Now all the Chenille It is on the outside raw edges of these appliques, on the large one and also in the small hexagon in the center. But it doesn't look like hexagons, so in order to make it look like hexagons, I'm going to add a row in between each one of these hexagons to give it the shape that it needs to have. So we're just going to start up at the top, do a couple of back stitches, and stitch to the center. All the chenille has been added to our raw edges, and our lines for our hexagons are added. So now the pillow top is finished and ready to be put together with the backing, the binding, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, and wash and dry. Just wait for the finished result. One of my favorite things to do with raw edge applique is making pillows with names, with words. This is going to be a dream pillow, and I'm using the 3/8 inch width again to finish off the raw edge appliques. You can see I've already stitched close to the edge on my raw edge applique. We're doing the word dream, and we're also using several colors so that it's going to have a real fun look to it. Over on the D, you can see that you can also layer appliques on top of appliques. I wanted to have a star on this pillow, so the star has been laid down first. The D letter is on top of that. So now as I add the Chenille It to the raw edge, the same way we did on the Hexagon pillow top, I'm going to do what is in the background first. So I put the Chenille It on the edge of the star first. I did exactly the same thing going around my corners. When I come to a corner, I flip, come to a point, flip, and went around the edge of the star. And now we'll do the raw edge covering on the D letter. We're going to go around this corner at the top of the D in a little bit different way, just to show that there are different ways of doing things and not necessarily right and wrong ways. It's whatever is easiest and fastest for you. On the top of the D, I have a very sharp turn and corner. So rather than flipping it, because I want to make sure that that raw edge is completely covered, I'm going to go to the very end and trim it off, and I'm going to lay down on top of that a piece of the 3/8 going the other direction, and I'm going to stitch down all the way to the end. Then I'm going to back stitch just 2 or 3 stitches, and now I can turn and go the other direction. You can see now how all the edges, raw edges on these letter appliques are going to be finished with the 3/8 inch wide Chenille It. We'll go ahead, finish covering all the edges on the letters, layer it, finish our edge, throw it in the washer and dryer. And one question that we always get asked about the Chenille It is exactly how it should be washed. The best way to wash it is in an agitating washer. Most of the newer washers don't do that anymore, so if you have a newer washing machine, just throw something in with your chenille project, like a pair of tennis shoes, tennis balls, a couple of old towels, so that there is something in there to agitate the edges of that Chenille It and loosen those edges. And then throw it in the dryer, in a warm dryer, and completely dry, and when it comes out, it will be all fluffed up. One of my favorite things to do with the 5/8 inch width of the Chenille It blooming bias is to finish the edges of your quilt with chenille instead of binding. You can see on this Sweet Home quilt by Sharon, Holland, that the edges have been finished with Chenille It blooming bias, and it gives a very soft finished texture to the edge of your quilt. And I've also added 3/8 inch wide Chenille It on the seams around my blocks and around the cornerstones, and that's just making my blocks and the detail on this quilt pop. One of the most popular ways of finishing the edges now is with Chenille It blooming bias instead of binding. This is a pillow top. You would do a quilt exactly the same way. You would have your finished quilt top and your edges are going to be serged or zigzagged once you've trimmed your edges. On this one I have serged the edge. You can also just zigzag that. If you have just a zigzag machine, that's all you need. Just make sure that edge is serged so that your raw edges don't fray out. And once that is done, I'm going to start on the back of my pillow top. You can see I just have wrong sides together and the edge is finished off. I've already started. I did a couple of edges so that you can see what that looks like from the back. Now we're going to flip around here and do the next edge. You just come along your edge, cut it off at the end. To go the next direction, I'm just going to lay that down on top of the corner that came before. I'm just stitching down the center of the tape, and I'm able to line that up with the other corner. And the thing that you want to do when you're stitching it on the back is lift this up so that you can just see that I'm extending the edge of the Chenille It about 1/8 of an inch past the serged edge. So I'll lift that up just to make sure it's in place. Stitch down the center of the tape, and then I'll come down another 4 or 5 inches, make sure that it's extended, and keep sewing until I come to the next corner. Now you can see the fun top on this this pillow that we're making. One of the other things that you can do with Chenille It is make whatever design you want. The holidays are coming up, Christmas is around the corner, or just winter. We've done a fun snowflake. This is done with a double layer of Chenille It of the 5/8 inch width Chenille It blooming bias, and all the little lines. You can see we've done this on Instagram so you can see how that goes together. But now we're going to finish the edge of this pillow like the same as we would a quilt, and we're also using 2 layers of the 5/8 inch width on both sides of the edge of this pillow because I want it to be really nice and fluffy. Because I extended it 1/8 of an inch beyond the edge of my serged or zigzagged edge, I can actually see. It's a little hard to see on the white on white, but because I can see where that back edge is, it makes it really easy to just line up the front and stitch that on all 4 edges. I'm just lining up the front edge with the back and stitch down the center of the bias all the way around my pillow top. Super easy, super fast, and it's going to give me a wonderful soft chenille edge. One of my favorite things to do with the 3/8 width blooming bias is adding it to panels, pre-printed panels. Take a look at this We Can Fly quilt. This is Peter Pan and Wendy on top of the clouds in London. And doesn't this look like it is appliqué? Look at the ship, the details on the clouds, and especially on the houses down in London and Big Ben. This quilt was originally done with raw edge appliqué, and everyone wanted the pattern. And so now it has been digitally printed as a panel, so all you have to do is add the Chenille It. Now the Peter Pan quilt is pre-printed. All the work's been done. There's no appliques, no piecing involved, and this quilt has been designed for Chenille It blooming bias by Erin Dahl, and it's kind of like paint by number. It's all you have to do is add the Chenille It blooming bias to the black lines to get the finished result of that quilt. This is another panel from the storybook collection. This time we are working with Princess and the Pea, another really fun fairy tale. This panel was done the same way. It's pre-printed. All we had to do was add the Chenille It blooming bias to the black lines. And another thing that you can do with your panel quilts is add additional borders to them to make them bigger. This one we've added the match coordinating fabric piano key border. And again, the Chenille It has been added on all the lines to make it look like it's pieced. And we've added a panel on the bottom and written with the 3/8 inch Chenille It, Once Upon a Time. So you can write with your Chenille It, do any kind of letters or writing. You can even write it yourself and have it in your own handwriting, or get a font from the internet to put the words or the names that you want, the special message on the bottom of a special quilt. This is one of my favorite Christmas panels, Peace on Earth. It's a Moda panel, and we've added Chenille It to the words, the Peace on Earth. We've just gone down the center of all the letters with the 3/8 inch wide Chenille It. I've outlined the bird, the dove, and added some detail with the gray in the wings and the tail. The snowflakes are done with 3/8 inch Chenille It, just following the lines on the panel. And probably the most fun thing about this panel is she has wonderful pieced blocks all the way around the edge that were printed on, but by adding Chenille It around the edges of those blocks and outlining them, it really makes this border look like it has been completely pieced. There are panels now with every kind of design imaginable, with animals, and one of my favorites are the wonderful flower panels that have been designed. This is Moody Bloom by Moda, and you can see here how different it looks once we've added the Chenille It blooming bias from the original panel on the left. The panel she does wonderful watercolors. Create Joy Project does wonderful hand-painted watercolors that are turned into these fabulous panels. And I want to accent almost her brush strokes and the feel of that watercolor with the Chenille It blooming bias. And you can see how that's been done on the finished panel after it's been washed and dried, and the Chenille It blooms. And when you're working on a panel like this, you want to add the chenille working from the back to the front. So I have done the leaves first and the things that are in the background, and I've done the outside of the roses first and worked towards the center, so that your chenille is overlapping much the same way as everything in nature is, and how you are looking at that hand-painted wall hanging. This panel is called Dream Big. The original panel is a digital photograph printed onto fabric of a beautiful flower, and it's printed in a lot of different color variations. But you can see in the original panel that the colors are very muted and soft, and kind of have a very interesting texture to them, and I wanted to have that same look on the finished panel. Now, in all the quilts that we've looked at so far, we've used a single layer of the 3/8 blooming bias, but on this quilt, instead of using a single layer, I've used 2 layers to get the color effect, so that I have that ombre look to the same ombre look to my Chenille It as I have on the finished quilt. So on all of the petals, there is a layer of white on top with a color underneath, going from lavender on the outside petals to hot pink to pale pink to tangerine and yellow in the center of the flower. The edge of this quilt is also finished with the 5/8 inch blooming bias, but we've added a little twist to this one as well. We have two layers of the white on the back, but on the front I have one layer of 5/8 white and one layer of 3/8 lavender, and that's putting a lavender stripe in my binding and tying that in with the rest of the quilt. Another popular thing with print on fabrics right now in fabric collections is what we used to call cheater fabrics, where the fabric is actually designed and printed so that it looks like it's pieced. This is The Spirit of Halloween by Corey Dantini, and this fabric collection is fun because it's a cheater fabric. What we used to call a cheater fabric, where the design is printed right on the fabric and it looks like it's pieced. But we're going to make it look like it's really pieced by adding Chenille It blooming bias in between, on just following the lines that she has designed on her fabric and covering that with Chenille It blooming bias. This is the 3/8 width, a single layer. And then she also designed some wonderful larger blocks that we're going to add to a quilt and use as cornerstones or for the border. And you'll see how this all comes together on a finished quilt. This is a fun quilt for the Halloween season and for fall. We've used the fabric that had the piece design in the center of the quilt and used it just like a center panel for the quilt. The Chenille It 3/8 inch blooming bias has been added on all the lines. We used the large blocks for the corners of our borders and picked a couple of the coordinating fabrics to do our border, and then cut apart some of those individual fun little designs that were in the center panel and just laid those down on the borders as a raw edge applique. Those are not pieced in. Let's take a look at one of the border sides just close up so you can see how we've taken some of those individual designs and done a raw edge applique and covered that raw edge with the Chenille It. No piecing involved there. Again, the edge has been finished with a 5/8 inch bias instead of binding to keep that give that whole quilt that soft chenille finish and tie it all in. You can have so much fun with a whole cloth quilt. This butterfly garden quilt has raw edge applique butterflies and flowers, but now I can take the 3/8 inch bias and just make my vines and stems wherever I want all over my quilt. One of the questions we get asked all the time is, when do I quilt the quilt? Do I quilt it before the chenille is added or after the chenille is added? I always put the chenille on first and then quilt, but you can do custom quilting like I did around the butterflies and the flowers on this quilt. But you will also find a video on our Chenille It channel on YouTube that shows doing an edge-to-edge quilting on this same quilt design. So if you're doing an edge-to-edge quilt pattern, you can stitch over the Chenille It and it will still bloom. You just don't want to use a really close, dense stitching pattern when you select your edge-to-edge design. Another typical quilting design is the diamond. This diamond quilt was wonderful by itself. These are large diamonds that were just pieced, but I wanted to give it a really different, fun, new twist to a diamond design. So I have added a double layer of the 5/8 inch black bias down the center of these diamonds, crisscross that both directions, and now this quilt has the look of an argyle design. Again, with the edge finished with a 5/8 inch black bias, giving the quilt a totally finished and soft textured look. Another traditional design, quilting design and technique that I had always wanted to do but didn't have the time and patience to do all the narrow black bias turned under that was required to do a stained glass quilt. This stained glass quilt has the look of the traditional stained glass, but it's just raw edge applique with the 3/8 bias covering those raw edges where it would traditionally have the finished turned under black bias tape. Have you ever made a rag quilt with multiple layers of fabric that have to be layered, and then all those squares have to be clipped and cut, and then you have to do the same thing on the edge, and then when you wash it, your washing machine is full of lint because you did that all on the straight of grain? That's why you had to clip all those edges, because straight of grain edges will not give you texture by itself. So you have to do all that clipping, and when you clip straight of grain fabric, all those threads have no place to go but in your washing machine. But this is my version of a rag quilt. I just pieced my blocks, and I didn't have to have all those layers, so this quilt is much lighter weight, softer, and much, really more cuddly. And once all my blocks were pieced, I just took a single layer of the 5/8 inch wide bias and stitched that over the top of all my seams. And then I can even do some other fun things to it. I've added an extra applique on top. After all of that was stitched on, I put the star appliques on top, and those were raw edge appliques that were finished with the 3/8 inch bias. Then I went back and finished my edges the same way that we've been talking about on other quilts, with the 5/8 inch wide bias, 2 layers on either side. And now I have this wonderful textured quilt that did not make a mess in my washing machine, and I can make 4 quilts with the same amount of fabric by using this technique. If you're a quilter and you quilt your quilts, you're familiar with quilting stencils. Quilting stencils are wonderful, and there are hundreds and hundreds of quilting stencils out there for you to use when you're quilting your quilts. But I use the quilting stencils to mark my quilt blocks and then add chenille designs. This gives a real vintage chenille look to my quilts. I've used 2 different stencils on this quilt. Just marked those with a bounce pad so that I had a line to follow. And the wonderful thing about quilting stencils, it is a continuous line design, so it's perfect to lay down chenille it. I can just start at the beginning of a line and follow that line around, and on the stencils I am just flipping at the corners. Do not ever bother to cut and turn. All these corners are just flipped and turned. But what a wonderful way to add a vintage texture, and there's just hundreds and hundreds of designs to choose from. Wouldn't these designs make a beautiful border on the edge of another quilt? There are so many fun patterns that you can do with jelly rolls. This is a jelly roll quilt that I made actually years ago, and pieced and quilted and finished, but I was never really all that excited about it. So I took that finished quilt, added 3/8 inch chenille around my outlining some of the different sections of the quilt and around the shorter sections. And now I was able to make all of those design lines and those fabrics pop. The other thing, when you're working with a finished quilt, it's probably already bound and finished, as this one was with a traditional fabric binding. So whenever I have a traditional fabric binding, I still like to add a single layer of the 3/8 bias over that seam, and it just outlines my quilt. It gives it that final detail that I didn't have before I add the Chenille It blooming bias.